The gunshot that split the morning air wasn't what caught Isaac Dalton's attention, but rather the silence that followed it. Standing on the porch of his ranch house in Unionville, Nevada, he watched a lone rider approach through the shimmering heat of July 1882. Sitting so still in the saddle, it looked like the horse was carrying a ghost. Most ranch hands rode with swagger or exhaustion, but this figure moved with an economy of motion that spoke of someone who understood that the desert demanded respect and nothing wasted, not even movement. Isaac wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted against the glare. His foreman, Buck Patterson, had mentioned hiring a new hand after 3 of their crew had quit last month to chase silver rumors up in the mountains. The ranch couldn't afford to lose any more time with cattle needing to be moved to higher pastures before the worst of the summer heat settled in. He needed reliable workers, not dreamers. The rider dismounted with a fluid grace that made Isaac reassess his initial impression. The figure was slight, wrapped in dust-covered clothes that hung loose, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low enough to shadow most of the face. When the newcomer finally looked up, Isaac found himself staring into a pair of startlingly clear gray eyes that held his gaze without flinching. "Name's Casey Sullivan," the rider said, voice kept low and rough. "Your foreman said you needed hands for the drive." Isaac studied the newcomer carefully. Casey was small-framed, but he'd seen plenty of wiry cowboys who could outwork men twice their size. The hands that held the reins were gloved, but they looked steady and sure. "You ever worked cattle before, since I could sit a horse," Casey replied. "Worked a spread down in Arizona Territory until the owner died and his son sold off everything. Can rope, brand, mend fence, break horses if you need it." "Breaking horses is different than herding cattle through rough country," Isaac said, crossing his arms. "We're moving 1,500 head up to the summer range starting next week. It's going to be hot, dusty, and mean work. Some of those steers haven't seen a human being in months, and they don't take kindly to being pushed around." Casey's expression didn't change. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Dalton. I just need the job." There was something in those words, a quiet desperation that Isaac recognized because he'd felt it himself years ago. He'd built this ranch from nothing after the war, scraping together every dollar, working until his hands bled and his back screamed. He understood what it meant to need work so badly that failure wasn't an option. "Buck says you can start today," Isaac said finally. "Bunkhouse is that building there. Wages are $30 a month plus meals. You pull your weight, we'll get along fine. You cause trouble or can't handle the work, you're gone. Understood?" "Understood," Casey said, then led the horse toward the stable without another word. Isaac watched the new hand go, trying to shake the odd feeling that had settled over him. Something about Casey Sullivan didn't quite add up, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was just the way the young man moved, so careful and controlled, like someone trying not to draw attention. Or maybe it was those eyes, which had held a depth of experience that seemed at odds with what couldn't be more than 23 or 24 years of age. The ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of Nevada high desert, anchored by the East Fork of the Carson River that provided the water that made the whole operation possible. Isaac had bought the land 10 years ago when he'd mustered out of the Union Army with a captain's savings and a desperate need to build something that couldn't be destroyed by war. He'd started with 50 head of cattle and a tent. Now he ran over 2,000 head, employed 8 regular hands plus seasonal workers, and owned one of the most productive ranches in Humboldt County. It had cost him everything else, though. His wife Margaret had died 6 years ago from pneumonia during a brutal winter, and their daughter Sarah had been taken by scarlet fever the year after that. Isaac had thrown himself into the work after that, letting the ranch consume him, because it was easier than remembering what he'd lost. At 38, he was successful, respected, and profoundly alone. By evening, Buck Patterson found Isaac in the main barn checking on a mare that had thrown a shoe that morning. Buck was 52, bow-legged from a lifetime in the saddle, and had been with Isaac since the beginning. He was also one of the few people who dare to speak his mind to the boss. "That new hand, Sullivan," Buck said, leaning against a stall door. "Kid can ride. Took one of the green broncs out to the north pasture and had him working smooth as butter by lunchtime. Didn't make a fuss about it either, just did the job." Isaac straightened up, surprised. "The sorrel we've been trying to break for 2 months. Same one. I watched him work. Wasn't rough about it, just patient and firm." Horse responded like he'd been waiting for someone who knew how to talk to him proper. Buck pulled out a plug of tobacco and bit off a piece. "Something else, too. Sullivan don't talk much. Barely said 2 words to the other hands at dinner. Ate fast and went straight to the bunkhouse." "Maybe he's just tired from traveling," Isaac suggested, though he'd noticed the same thing himself. During the evening meal, Casey had sat at the far end of the table, keeping his hat on despite the heat, eating quickly with his head down. Buck grunted. "Maybe. Or maybe he's running from something. Either way, if he can work like he did today, I don't much care. We need the help." Over the next week, Isaac found himself watching Casey Sullivan more than he probably should have. The new hand was punctual, tireless, and extraordinarily skilled with horses and cattle alike. Casey could rope a steer with the first throw, could gentle a skittish horse with patience and soft words, and could ride better than any hand Isaac had ever employed. But there was something almost invisible about the way Casey moved through the ranch, always on the periphery, always quiet. The other hands had tried to draw Sullivan into conversation, but after a few days, they'd given up and accepted that the new hire preferred silence. Nobody seemed to mind much. In a profession where bragging and tall tales were common currency, there was something refreshing about someone who just did the work without needing recognition. It was on the 4th day that Isaac began to suspect the truth, though he didn't want to believe it at first. He'd been up before dawn checking on the cattle in the holding pens when he'd heard singing coming from the river. Following the sound, he'd found Casey washing in the shallows, shirt off, back turned to the shore. Even from a distance and in the dim pre-dawn light, Isaac could see the curve of breasts bound tightly with strips of cloth, the undeniable shape of a woman's body despite the obvious efforts to hide it. He'd retreated immediately, his mind reeling. A woman. Casey Sullivan was a woman, and she'd been working alongside his crew for 4 days without anyone suspecting. The implications crashed over him like a wave. If the other hands found out, there would be trouble. If word spread to neighboring ranches, there would be talk. And if Casey, or whatever her real name was, got hurt on his watch, he'd never forgive himself. But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, another part of him was already acknowledging what Buck had said. She was the best rider he'd ever hired. In 4 days, she'd accomplished more than some hands did in a month. She'd broken the sorrel, mended half a mile of fence line, and helped deliver a breech calf without batting an eye at the blood and mess. She worked harder than anyone else, never complained, and had earned the grudging respect of the crew simply through competence. Isaac spent the whole day wrestling with what to do. He should fire her, send her away before someone got hurt or the deception was discovered. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But every time he worked himself up to do it, he remembered those gray eyes looking at him with quiet desperation, saying she just needed the job. That evening, he waited until the other hands had finished dinner and drifted off to play cards or smoke before he approached Casey, who was brushing down her horse in the stable. "Sullivan, a word," he said, keeping his voice level. She turned, and he saw the instant wariness in her expression. "Yes, sir." Isaac glanced around to make sure they were alone, then said quietly, "I know." The color drained from her face. She didn't ask what he meant. Instead, she stood very still, one hand still on the horse's flank, and waited. "I'm not going to ask why," Isaac continued, surprising himself with the words even as he spoke them. "And I'm not going to fire you, not yet anyway. But I need to know your real first name, and I need the truth about whether you're running from the law or a husband or something else that's going to bring trouble to my ranch." She was quiet for a long moment, her jaw tight. Finally, she said, "It's Caitlin Sullivan. And I'm not running from the law. My father died 2 years ago. He was a rancher down in Arizona, raised me on his own after my mother died when I was born. He taught me everything he knew about horses and cattle. When he died, his business partner took over the ranch and said he'd take care of me too, but what he meant was he expected me to marry him. He was 53 and mean when he drank, so I left." "And you've been working as a man ever since?" Isaac asked. "It's the only way to get honest work," Caitlin said, meeting his eyes with that same unflinching gaze. "Nobody will hire a woman to ride herd or break horses, no matter how good she is. The only jobs available are cooking, cleaning, or worse. I'm good at what I do, Mr. Dalton. I'm probably better at it than most of your crew. I just need the chance to do it without being judged for being born female." Isaac couldn't argue with that. He'd seen her work. She was better than most of his crew. "And if the others find out—" "They won't if you don't tell them," she said. "I've been doing this for 2 years. I know how to be careful. I wash away from camp. I keep to myself. I don't cause problems. Just let me do my job." He should say no. He should pay her for the week's work and send her on her way. Instead, he found himself nodding slowly. "All right. But there are conditions. You keep up this level of work. You don't take unnecessary risks. And if there's ever a situation where your secret is about to come out or where it puts you or anyone else in danger, you tell me immediately." "Understood." Relief flooded her face, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she smiled. It transformed her entire appearance, lighting up those gray eyes and softening the hard lines she kept around her mouth. "Understood. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. You won't regret this." As she turned back to her horse, Isaac hoped she was right. But watching her work the brush through the animal's coat with firm, steady strokes, he had a sinking feeling that he'd just made the situation far more complicated than it needed to be. Because that smile had done something to him, had reached past all the walls he'd built around his heart and touched something he'd thought long dead. The cattle drive to the summer pastures began the following Monday under a sky that promised no mercy. Isaac, Buck, and 6 hands including Caitlin pushed the herd northwest toward the higher elevations where the grass stayed green even through the brutal Nevada summer. The first day was chaos, as it always was, with cattle breaking from the herd and having to be chased down, dust so thick it coated everything, and the constant bellowing of 1,500 confused and irritated animals. Caitlin rode the right flank position, which was one of the harder assignments because it required constant vigilance and quick reflexes to keep the cattle from scattering. Isaac watched her work from his position at the front of the herd and found himself continually impressed. She anticipated problems before they developed, cutting off potential breaks before they started, working her horse with the kind of seamless partnership that came from years of experience. On the second day, one of the hands, a young man named Pete Ramsey who'd been with the ranch less than a year, sidled up to Isaac during the midday break. "That Sullivan is something else," Pete said, pulling off his bandana to wipe his face. "Rides like he was born in the saddle. Quiet as a church mouse, though. I tried talking to him this morning and got about 3 words back." Isaac took a drink from his canteen, watching Caitlin across the camp where she sat alone eating jerky and hardtack. "Some men aren't much for conversation. As long as he does his job, I don't care if he recites poetry or stays silent." "Don't get me wrong, boss. I'm not complaining," Pete said quickly. "Just making an observation. That horse of his minds him like they share a brain. And I saw him rope that steer yesterday on the first throw from 30 feet out. That takes skill." It took more than skill, Isaac thought. It took the kind of natural talent that couldn't be taught, combined with years of practice and an understanding of animals that came from genuine affection for them. He'd watched Caitlin with the horses and cattle, had seen the way she touched them, spoke to them, treated them like partners rather than beasts of burden. It reminded him of his daughter Sarah, who'd loved every creature on the ranch and had cried when they had to brand the calves. That night, after the camp was settled and the other hands were asleep or on watch with the herd, Isaac found Caitlin sitting by the dying fire, staring into the coals. He sat down across from her, and she glanced up with that guarded expression she always wore. "You did good work today," he said quietly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkness. "I meant what I said back at the ranch. You're the best rider I've ever hired." The words came out before he'd fully thought them through, but he realized they were true. "Buck agrees. Said you make the work look easy." Caitlin's expression softened slightly. "Your foreman is a good man, knows his business. I've worked places where the foreman thought yelling and threatening was the same as leading. Mr. Patterson just shows you what needs doing and trusts you to do it." "That's because I trust Buck's judgment about who to hire," Isaac said, then added with a slight smile, "even when he brings on people who aren't quite what they seem." A faint flush colored her cheeks, visible even in the firelight. "I never lied to you. I just didn't correct your assumptions." "I know," Isaac said, "and for what it's worth, I understand why. The world isn't kind to women who step outside the lines it draws for them. My wife used to say that the only thing worse than being told what you couldn't do was being told you couldn't do it because of something you had no control over, like being born female." Caitlin looked at him with new interest. "Your wife sounds like she was wise." "She was," Isaac said, surprised at how easily the words came. He rarely spoke about Margaret. "She died 6 years ago, pneumonia. Our daughter died the next year. After that, I just focused on the ranch. Easier to work than to think sometimes." "I'm sorry," Caitlin said, and he could hear the genuine sympathy in her voice. "My father was everything to me. When he died, I felt like the ground had disappeared under my feet. The only thing that kept me going was knowing I had to keep doing what he taught me, keep honoring what he'd passed on." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the herd settling for the night and the soft conversations of the hands on watch. Finally, Caitlin said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you fire me when you found out?" "Most men would have, just to avoid the complications." Isaac considered the question carefully. "Because you were right when you said you're good at what you do. Because I built this ranch from nothing and I remember what it's like to need a chance. And because I don't see why someone's skill should be dismissed just because of their gender. That seems like a waste of talent to me." Caitlin smiled again, that same transforming expression he'd seen in the stable. "Thank you. That means more than you probably know." As Isaac walked back to his bedroll, he found himself thinking about that smile, about the quiet strength in Caitlin's voice, about the way her eyes reflected the firelight. He told himself he was just being a decent employer, just doing what was right. But deep down, in a place he'd thought had gone cold and dead, he felt something stirring back to life, and it scared him more than he wanted to admit. The drive continued for 3 more days through increasingly rough terrain. They crossed dry washes and rocky canyons, pushed the herd up steep switchbacks where one wrong step could send an animal tumbling, navigated through stands of juniper and pinon that caught at their clothes and scratched their faces. The heat was relentless, turning the air into something that had to be chewed rather than breathed, and tempers grew short as exhaustion set in. On the 4th day, trouble came in the form of a rattlesnake that spooked a group of cattle on the left flank. The animals panicked and broke from the herd, thundering toward a steep ravine that dropped 50 feet to a rocky bottom. 2 hands tried to head them off and failed, and for a moment, it looked like they were going to lose 20 head over the edge. Then Caitlin was there, her horse moving with incredible speed, cutting across the stampeding cattle's path. She leaned low in the saddle, waving her hat and shouting, turning the lead steer just feet from the ravine's edge. The others followed, and within minutes she had the group circling back toward the main herd, crisis averted. Isaac reached her just as she was catching her breath, her horse blowing hard from the effort. "That was the damnedest piece of riding I've ever seen," he said, his heart still pounding from watching her risk her life so casually. "Just doing my job," Caitlin said, but he could see the adrenaline in her eyes, the flush of exertion on her cheeks. "You could have been killed," Isaac said, more sharply than he intended, "if your horse had stumbled or if those cattle had turned on you instead of away." "But they didn't," she interrupted gently. "And we didn't lose any animals. Sometimes you have to take risks in this work. You know that." He did know that. He'd taken plenty of risks himself over the years, but watching her charge toward that ravine had made his blood run cold in a way that surprised him with its intensity. When had he started caring so much about what happened to her? When had she become more than just another hand? Buck rode up before Isaac could respond, his weathered face split in a huge grin. "Boy, that was something. Sullivan, I've been working cattle for 35 years and I've never seen anyone ride like that. Where'd you learn to handle a horse that way?" Caitlin ducked her head, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "My father was particular about teaching me right. Said if you're going to do something, you should do it as well as you possibly can." "Well, your father taught you damn well," Buck declared. "Boss, I'm telling you, this is the best hire we've made in years. Give Sullivan here a raise." The other hands had gathered around now, all of them talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed. Pete Ramsey clapped Caitlin on the shoulder, and Isaac saw her flinch slightly at the contact before forcing herself to relax. "You saved our bacon for sure, Sullivan. Those steers were money walking, and you kept them from going over that cliff. Drinks are on us when we get back to town." Caitlin managed a smile, but Isaac could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her distance even as she accepted their praise. It had to be exhausting, he realized, maintaining the disguise every single moment, never letting her guard down, always worried that one wrong move would expose her secret and destroy everything. That night, after the herd was settled and the camp was quiet, Isaac found himself walking toward where Caitlin had spread her bedroll away from the others, as she always did. She was sitting up, staring at the stars that spread across the Nevada sky in a glittering canopy impossible to see from any city. "Mind if I sit?" he asked quietly. She shook her head, and he lowered himself to the ground beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them. "You scared me today," he said after a moment. "When you went after those cattle." "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't think, I just reacted. It's what my father would have done." "I know. And it was brave, and it saved us a lot of money and trouble, but it also made me realize something. Isaac paused, trying to find the right words. I've been alone for a long time. After Margaret and Sarah died, I told myself I was better off that way. Loving people just means eventually losing them, and I couldn't go through that pain again. So I focused on the ranch and told myself that was enough. Caitlin turned to look at him, her gray eyes luminous in the starlight. But watching you almost go over that cliff today, I felt something I haven't felt in 6 years. Terror at the thought of losing someone who matters to me. The words came out rough, almost angry, because he was still trying to fight against them even as he spoke. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks, you started to matter, Caitlin, and I don't quite know what to do about that. She was quiet for a long moment, and he braced himself for rejection. Instead, she said softly, you started to matter to me too. The first day when you looked at me and I thought you were going to turn me away, and then you gave me a chance. You've been kind without being condescending. You've let me do my job without constantly questioning whether I can handle it. And tonight, you came over here because you were worried about me, not because you wanted something from me. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Seems like basic decency to me, Isaac said. It should be, Caitlin agreed. But it's not. Most men either want to control me or use me. You just want me to be who I am. That's a gift I never expected to receive. Without quite meaning to, Isaac reached out and took her hand. It was smaller than his, calloused from years of hard work, and it fit perfectly into his palm. I don't know where this goes, he admitted. I don't know how we navigate this with the ranch and the crew and all the complications. I don't either, Caitlin said, her fingers tightening around his. But maybe we can figure it out together. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the night sounds of the desert. And for the first time since Margaret's death, Isaac felt the tight knot of grief in his chest begin to loosen, replaced by something fragile and new and terrifying in its intensity. The drive reached the summer pastures 2 days later, and the work of getting the herd settled into their new range kept everyone busy from dawn until long after dark. Isaac and Caitlin had no time alone together, but he found himself constantly aware of where she was, what she was doing. Their eyes would meet across the camp or the herd, and something would pass between them, a connection that grew stronger with each look. Buck noticed, of course. Nothing got past Buck. One evening when he and Isaac were riding the perimeter of the camp, the foreman said casually, "You're looking at Sullivan different lately." Isaac felt heat rise to his face. "I don't know what you mean." "Sure you don't," Buck said with a knowing grin. "Boss, I've known you for 10 years. I watched you court Margaret, watched you smile at your daughter. I haven't seen that look on your face since they died. And now here it is again, every time you glance at that quiet kid who can ride like the wind." There was no point in denying it. Buck was too perceptive for that. "It's complicated," Isaac said finally. "Most things worth having are," Buck replied. "I like Sullivan. Good worker, good with the animals, doesn't cause trouble. If you found someone who makes you smile again, I'm not going to complain. Just be careful. These aren't easy times for people who don't fit into neat boxes." "I know," Isaac said. "Believe me, I know." When they returned to the ranch 3 days later, dirty and exhausted but successful, Isaac made a decision. The hands dispersed to clean up and rest, and he asked Caitlin to stay behind in the barn. "I need to talk to you about your living situation," he said without preamble. "You can't keep staying in the bunkhouse. It's too risky. Eventually someone is going to figure out the truth, and when they do, I'm worried about what might happen." Wariness crossed Caitlin's face. "Are you firing me?" "No," Isaac said quickly. "Just the opposite. There's a small cabin on the north edge of the property, about a mile from the main house. It was built as a line shack, but it's empty now. It's not fancy, just one room with a stove and a bed, but it's private. I want you to move there. You can still work with the crew during the day, but you'll have your own space where you don't have to maintain the disguise every minute." "Why would you do that?" Caitlin asked, confused. "Because I care about you," Isaac said simply. "Because you deserve to be able to let your guard down sometimes. And because if we're going to explore whatever this is between us, you need a safe space." Tears welled in Caitlin's eyes and she blinked them back furiously. "I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." "Then just say yes," Isaac said, reaching out to touch her cheek. It was the first time he'd touched her face, and he marveled at the softness of her skin, the delicate line of her jaw. "Say you'll take the cabin. Say you'll let me court you properly, even if we have to do it in secret for a while." "Yes," Caitlin whispered. "Yes to all of it." The kiss that followed was gentle and sweet, full of promise and possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless and smiling, and Isaac felt like he'd been given a second chance at something he'd thought lost forever. Caitlin moved into the cabin that evening, and Isaac helped her carry her few possessions from the bunkhouse. The structure was small but solidly built, with an iron stove for cooking and heating, a rope bed with a corn husk mattress, a table and 2 chairs, and hooks on the wall for hanging clothes and gear. A window looked out over the valley, framing a view of the mountains that turned purple in the evening light. "It's perfect," Caitlin said, running her hand along the rough wooden table. "I've never had my own place before. After Father died and I left Arizona, I've been living in bunkhouses or camping out on the trail. Having 4 walls and a door that locks feels like luxury." Isaac found himself imagining what it would be like to share this space with her, to wake up beside her in that narrow bed, to cook meals together at that small stove. "You'll still come to the main house for meals with the crew," he said, forcing himself to focus on practical matters. "We don't want to raise suspicions by changing your routine too much, but in the evenings you'll have privacy." "And you'll visit?" Caitlin asked, a hint of shyness in her voice. "If you want me to," Isaac said. "I don't want to presume." She cut him off by standing on her toes and kissing him again, this time with more confidence. "I want you to," she said against his lips. "I want to know you without the whole ranch watching. I want to hear your stories and tell you mine. I want to explore this feeling that scares me and thrills me in equal measure." So began a pattern that would shape the next months of their lives. During the day, Caitlin worked as Casey Sullivan, one of the ranch hands. She rode fence lines, tended cattle, broke green horses, and did all the tasks required of a skilled cowhand. She kept her distance from the other workers, maintained her disguise, and gave no one reason to question who or what she was. But in the evenings, after dinner was finished and the crew had dispersed to their own pursuits, Isaac would slip away from the main house and make the mile-long ride to the cabin. There, Caitlin would be waiting, her hair unbound from its tight braid, her body free of the confining bindings, wearing a simple dress that Isaac had quietly purchased in town. They would talk for hours about everything and nothing, sharing their histories, their dreams, their fears. Isaac learned that Caitlin's father had been a Union cavalry officer who'd stayed in Arizona after the war, using his military pension to start a small ranch. He'd raised his daughter with the same discipline and skills he'd learned in the Army, never treating her as lesser simply because she was female. When he died from a heart attack at age 59, Caitlin had been 21 and devastated. Her father's partner, a man named Vernon Blake, who'd always made her uncomfortable, had immediately proposed marriage, presenting it as the obvious solution to her situation. He said, "I couldn't possibly run the ranch alone. that I needed a man to take care of me. Caitlin told Isaac one evening as they sat together on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. But what he really meant was that he wanted to own me the way he'd wanted to own the ranch. I saw it in his eyes. So I packed what I could carry, took my father's best horse, and left in the middle of the night. And you've been working as a man ever since?" Isaac asked, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "It was the only way," Caitlin said. "I tried getting work as myself first. But every job offered was cooking or cleaning or working in a saloon. And the men who offered those jobs always had expectations that went beyond just the work. Dressing as a man meant I could use the skills my father taught me, could earn decent wages, could be judged on my abilities instead of my body. It was either that or marry some stranger who wanted a housekeeper and broodmare more than a partner." Isaac tightened his arm around her, anger burning in his chest at a world that had forced her into such choices. "You shouldn't have had to hide who you are just to survive." "Maybe not," Caitlin agreed. "But that's the world we live in. I learned to adapt to it. The bindings are uncomfortable and the disguise is exhausting, but it's better than the alternatives I was offered." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, which always smelled faintly of horses and hay and something uniquely her. "You won't have to hide forever. We'll figure something out." But even as he said it, Isaac wasn't sure how they would navigate the complications their relationship presented. He couldn't simply announce that his best hand was actually a woman and that he was courting her. The scandal would ruin both their reputations and likely destroy the ranch's standing in the community. Yet the thought of asking Caitlin to continue the exhausting charade indefinitely seemed unbearably cruel. For now, though, they existed in their own private world in the evenings, and Isaac found himself falling deeper in love with each passing day. Caitlin was unlike anyone he'd ever known. She had his late wife Margaret's intelligence and strength, but where Margaret had found her power in social grace and managing a household, Caitlin's strength came from physical competence and hard-won skill. She could discuss literature and philosophy, but she could also explain the intricacies of horse psychology or predict the weather by reading the clouds. She was tender and fierce, vulnerable and unbreakable, and Isaac found himself constantly surprised by new facets of her personality. Summer deepened into fall, and the work of the ranch shifted with the seasons. They brought the cattle down from the high pastures before the first snows, branded the spring calves, repaired buildings and equipment in preparation for winter. Caitlin continued to excel at every task assigned to her, and the crew had stopped thinking of her as the new hand and simply accepted her as one of them. Buck continued to express his approval with increasing frequency, telling Isaac privately that hiring Sullivan had been the best decision they'd made in years. "That kid has more natural ability than anyone I've ever worked with," Buck said one October afternoon, as they watched Caitlin work a cutting horse through a group of cattle, separating out the ones that needed veterinary attention. "And more than that, there's judgment there. Sullivan knows when to push and when to back off, when to take a risk, and when to play it safe. That's something you can't teach. Either a person has it or they don't." Isaac felt pride swell in his chest, along with the constant undercurrent of fear that came from knowing how precarious their situation was. Every day that passed without discovery felt like a gift, but also like borrowed time. It couldn't last forever. Eventually, something would slip. Someone would notice, and the whole carefully constructed facade would come crashing down. The crisis came in early November, brought by a man Isaac had hoped never to see again. Vernon Blake arrived at the ranch on a cold morning when frost still glittered on the ground, riding an expensive horse and wearing clothes that marked him as a man of means. He was tall and thick-bodied, with graying hair and a face that had probably been handsome once, but had been coarsened by years of heavy drinking and hard living. Isaac was in the barn when one of the hands came to tell him he had a visitor. He walked out to find Blake standing in the yard, looking around with an assessing eye that made Isaac's hackles rise immediately. "Help you with something?" Isaac asked, keeping his voice level and professional. "Name's Vernon Blake," the man said, extending a hand that Isaac shook reluctantly. "I own a spread down in Arizona Territory. I'm looking for someone, thought you might have seen her." Young woman, about 23, dark hair, gray eyes. Would have been traveling alone, probably pretending to be something she's not. Name's Casey Sullivan. Isaac's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "What makes you think she'd be in Nevada?" "Because I've been tracking her for 2 years, Blake said, his voice taking on an edge. "She's my intended bride. Her father promised her to me before he died. She ran off before we could be married, probably scared of the responsibility. But she's my property by rights, and I mean to find her and bring her home." Rage boiled up in Isaac's chest, but he forced it down. Showing anger would only make Blake suspicious. "Sorry, can't help you. I haven't seen anyone matching that description. This is a working ranch, not a refuge for runaway women." Blake's eyes narrowed. "You sure about that? I heard in town that you recently hired a new hand, young fellow who keeps to himself. Quiet type, good with horses. That sound familiar?" "I've got 8 hands working this ranch," Isaac said. "A few of them are quiet. Most cowboys are, in my experience, but they're all men if that's what you're getting at." "Mind if I look around?" Blake asked, and it wasn't really a question. "Just to satisfy myself that the girl isn't here." Isaac wanted to refuse, but doing so would only confirm Blake's suspicions. "Suit yourself. But we've got work to do, so make it quick." As Blake began touring the ranch, Isaac fought the urge to panic. Caitlin was out on the range with Buck and 2 other hands, moving cattle to the winter pasture. She wouldn't be back until evening. If he could get Blake off the property before then, they might avoid disaster. But if Blake decided to wait, if he saw Caitlin and recognized her despite the disguise. Isaac found himself praying for the first time in years, desperate pleas for protection and wisdom racing through his mind. He followed Blake through the barn, the bunkhouse, the equipment sheds, watching the man examine every corner with increasing frustration. Finally, Blake stopped in the middle of the yard and turned to face Isaac. "Where's your crew right now?" he demanded. "Out working," Isaac said. "This is a ranch, not a social club. My hands are earning their wages." "I want to see them," Blake insisted. "All of them. Tonight when they come back." Isaac's mind raced, trying to find a way out of this trap. "Look, Mr. Blake, I sympathize with your situation. But I run a business here, and I can't have strangers disrupting my operation just because they're chasing after some girl who clearly doesn't want to be found. If your intended ran away 2 years ago, maybe you should consider that she made her choice." Blake's face darkened with anger. "She's a woman. Women don't get to make those kinds of choices. Her father gave her to me, and I'm going to have what's mine, with or without your cooperation. Now, you can either bring your hands in so I can look at them, or I can come back with the law and force you to cooperate." "On what grounds?" Isaac shot back. "You have no evidence that anyone here is the person you're looking for. You can't force me to disrupt my business based on nothing but suspicion." They stood there in the yard, locked in a silent battle of wills, until Buck appeared on horseback, riding hard toward the house. He pulled up short when he saw Blake, and Isaac saw the moment when his foreman recognized that something was seriously wrong. "Boss, we've got trouble up at the north pasture," Buck called out. "Mountain lion took down a calf. We need all hands to track it before it comes back for more." Isaac seized on the excuse gratefully. "You heard the man. I've got a predator threatening my livestock. I need to deal with that right now. Mr. Blake, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Blake's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue with the necessity of protecting livestock. "Fine, but I'm staying in Unionville and I'll be back. If I find out you've been lying to me, if I discover that girl is here and you've been hiding her, I'll make sure the whole county knows you've been harboring a runaway. See how your business does then." He mounted his horse and rode off, and Isaac let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Buck dismounted and came to stand beside him. "There's no mountain lion," the foreman said quietly. "But I saw that man coming up the road and I recognized him from Sullivan's description." "That's Vernon Blake, isn't it? The man Caitlin is running from." Isaac nodded, too shaken to be surprised that Buck had figured out the truth. "How long have you known about Caitlin being a woman?" "Since the second week," Buck said with a slight smile. "Boss, I've been working ranches since before you were born. You learn to notice things. The way she moved, the way she kept to herself, the way she flinched when the men got too close. I've seen it before, women trying to make their way in a man's world. I figured if you were all right with it, then so was I, and I was right. She's the best hand we've ever had." Relief flooded through Isaac. "Blake is looking for her. He's convinced I'm hiding her. If he sees her, if he recognizes her, then we don't let him see her," Buck said firmly. "Caitlin is one of ours now. We take care of our own. I'll send word to the hands to keep Sullivan out of sight until Blake leaves town. We'll say he took sick, or got sent to check on the line shacks, or whatever we need to say. But we're not letting that bastard take her." Isaac clasped Buck's shoulder, gratitude overwhelming him. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you." "Probably something noble and stupid," Buck said with a grin. "Now let's go find Caitlin and warn her before she rides back into a trap." They found her 3 miles out, helping Pete and another hand named Jim Corrigan move a small group of cattle. Isaac's heart clenched at the sight of her sitting easy in the saddle, her hat pulled low, completely unaware of the danger that had just arrived at the ranch. When she saw Isaac and Buck riding hard toward them, she immediately kicked her horse into a gallop to meet them. "What's wrong?" she asked as soon as she was within earshot. "Vernon Blake is here," Isaac said without preamble. "He's looking for you. He came to the ranch asking questions." All the color drained from Caitlin's face. "Did he see me? Did he recognize me?" "No, you were out on the range, but he's suspicious and he's staying in town. He threatened to come back with the law if I don't cooperate." Isaac reached out and took her hand, not caring that Pete and Jim were watching. "Buck and I have a plan. We're going to keep you out of sight until Blake gives up and leaves. But Caitlin, we need to talk about what happens next. We can't keep doing this indefinitely. He's not going to stop looking." Fear and determination warred on Caitlin's face. "I'm not going back to him. I'll leave, I'll run again if I have to, but I'm not marrying that man." "You're not running anywhere," Isaac said fiercely, "and you're not marrying him either. But we need a solution that doesn't involve you hiding for the rest of your life." Buck, who'd been listening to this exchange with his usual calm pragmatism, cleared his throat. "Seems to me there's an obvious answer here. Blake says Caitlin is his intended bride because her father promised her to him. But if she's already married to someone else, his claim becomes invalid. Woman can't be promised to 2 men. Isaac and Caitlin both turned to stare at him. "What are you suggesting?" Isaac asked slowly. "I'm suggesting you 2 stop dancing around what's been obvious to everyone with eyes for months now and make it legal," Buck said bluntly. "Boss, You've been happier these last few months than you've been since Miss Margaret died. And Caitlin, you look at him like he hung the moon. You're already spending every evening together out at that cabin. The only thing missing is a preacher's blessing and a piece of paper. Buck, we can't just... Caitlin started, then trailed off. Why not? Buck challenged. Give me one good reason why not, aside from the fact that it's fast and unconventional. You two love each other. That's plain as day, and it solves the Blake problem permanently. He can't claim a married woman. Isaac looked at Caitlin, his heart pounding. They'd never discussed marriage, had been taking things slowly despite the intensity of their feelings. But Buck was right. It was the solution to their problem, and more than that, it was what Isaac wanted with a fierce certainty that left no room for doubt. Caitlin, he said softly, squeezing her hand. I know this isn't how these things are supposed to be done. I should court you properly, should ask your permission to speak to your family, should give you time to consider. But we don't have time, and your family is gone. And the truth is I've known since that night under the stars on the drive that I wanted to spend my life with you. So I'm asking now, in the worst possible circumstances, with witnesses who are probably going to tease us about this for years. Will you marry me? Tears spilled down Caitlin's cheeks, but she was smiling. Yes. Yes, of course yes. I love you, Isaac. I think I started loving you the day you gave me a chance when you could have just sent me away. I'll marry you today if it means we get to face whatever comes together. Pete let out a whoop of joy and Jim started laughing. About damn time, Pete said. We've all been wondering when the boss was going to make an honest woman out of Sullivan, though I got to admit, finding out Sullivan is actually a woman is a hell of a surprise. You knew? Caitlin asked, shocked. We all knew, Jim said gently. Not at first, but after a few weeks it became pretty obvious to those of us paying attention. You're good, but you're not that good. Plus, we've seen the way the boss looks at you. Man doesn't look at another man like that. Isaac felt his face heat, but he couldn't bring himself to care about the embarrassment. How many others know? All of us, Pete said. We talked about it one night after you and Buck had gone to bed. Figured it was your business and Sullivan's. And since Sullivan was the best hand any of us had ever worked with, we decided to just keep our mouths shut and let you handle it however you saw fit. The way we figured, if the boss trusts someone, that's good enough for us. Gratitude and affection for his crew washed over Isaac. Thank you, all of you, for keeping the secret and for being decent about it. So what's the plan? Buck asked, always focused on practicalities. We can't exactly have a traditional wedding with the whole town invited. Blake will hear about it and show up to object. Then we don't have a traditional wedding, Isaac said, an idea forming. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Unionville once a month. Reverend Thomas. He's due in town next week. We get him to come out to the ranch quietly, have him marry us here with just the crew as witnesses. It'll be legal and binding, but Blake won't know about it until it's done. And then we tell Blake that Sullivan quit and moved on, Buck added. Send him chasing his tail in the wrong direction while Caitlin stays here as your wife, safe and legal. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best option they had. Isaac looked at Caitlin, saw the hope and love shining in her gray eyes and knew that whatever complications lay ahead, they would face them together. The week that followed was one of the most stressful of Isaac's life. They kept Caitlin hidden at the cabin, with Isaac or Buck bringing her meals and supplies. Blake came back to the ranch twice more, each time more aggressive and suspicious, demanding to see all the hands. Isaac told him that Sullivan had quit and ridden out 3 days earlier, heading north toward Idaho. Blake didn't believe him, but without proof, he couldn't do anything except make threats and promises to return with the law. Meanwhile, Isaac rode into Unionville and found Reverend Thomas at the boarding house where the circuit preacher stayed during his monthly visits. The Reverend was a kindly man in his 60s who'd been serving the scattered communities of rural Nevada for over 20 years. Isaac explained the situation, leaving out only the most scandalous details, and asked if the Reverend would be willing to perform a quiet ceremony at the ranch. Reverend Thomas studied Isaac with shrewd brown eyes. "This woman you want to marry, she's of age and entering into this freely." "She's 23 and it's entirely her choice," Isaac said. "I love her, Reverend, and she loves me. But there's a man trying to force her into a marriage she doesn't want, and we need to make sure she's legally protected." "Then I'll do it," the Reverend said. "God's purpose is better served by joining two people who love each other than by allowing a woman to be forced into servitude. I'll come out to your ranch tomorrow evening after my services in town are concluded." Isaac shook the man's hand, relief washing over him. One more day and Caitlin would be his wife. One more day and she would be safe. He returned to the ranch to find Buck had been busy. The foreman had organized the hands to clean the main house from top to bottom, had arranged for a special dinner to be prepared, and had even somehow procured a dress for Caitlin to wear. When Isaac asked where it had come from, Buck just winked and said he had his ways. That evening, Isaac rode out to the cabin to tell Caitlin everything was arranged. He found her standing by the window, watching the sun set over the mountains, wearing pants and a work shirt but with her hair unbound and falling in dark waves down her back. She turned when he entered and his breath caught at her beauty. "Tomorrow," he said, crossing the small space to take her in his arms, "tomorrow you'll be my wife." "I'm scared," Caitlin admitted, her face pressed against his chest. "What if something goes wrong? What if Blake finds out? What if the law sides with him?" "Then we'll fight," Isaac said fiercely. "Together. I'm not letting anyone take you away from me, Caitlin. Not Blake, not the law, not anyone. You're mine and I'm yours, and tomorrow we'll make it official before God and witnesses." She tilted her face up to kiss him, and the kiss deepened into something heated and desperate. They'd been careful in their physical relationship, both aware of the impropriety of going too far before marriage. But with the wedding less than 24 hours away, that restraint crumbled. They came together with a passion born of weeks of suppressed desire, claiming each other completely there in the small cabin, as the last light faded from the sky. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Isaac traced patterns on Caitlin's bare shoulder and marveled at the miracle of her presence in his life. A few months ago, he'd been alone and convinced he would stay that way forever. Now he was about to marry the most remarkable woman he'd ever known, a woman who could ride like the wind and rope like a professional and still melt in his arms with tender vulnerability. "I never thought I could be this happy again," he said quietly. "After Margaret and Sarah died, I was sure that part of my life was over. Thank you for proving me wrong." Caitlin turned to face him, her gray eyes serious in the dim light. "I need you to know something. I loved my father and I'll always treasure what he taught me. But I never imagined I could have a real partnership with someone, a marriage based on respect and equality instead of ownership. You've given me that, Isaac. You've treated me like an equal from the beginning, even when you thought I was a man. That's rare and precious, and I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for it." They made love again, slowly this time, savoring each touch and kiss, building memories to sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. And when Isaac finally returned to the main house in the early hours of morning, he felt like a different man than the one who'd watched a quiet rider approach through the heat shimmer all those months ago. The wedding took place the next evening in the main room of the ranch house, with the crew gathered as witnesses and Reverend Thomas presiding. Caitlin wore the dress Buck had procured, a simple blue calico that made her eyes look like storm clouds, and she'd left her hair down despite convention. Isaac wore his best suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral and hadn't touched since, and tried not to think about how his first wife would have felt about this hasty remarriage. But when Caitlin took his hand and spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, all his doubts vanished. This wasn't a betrayal of Margaret's memory. It was a new beginning, a different kind of love but no less real or valuable. Margaret would have wanted him to be happy, would have approved of this fierce, capable woman who'd stolen his heart. I, Caitlin Sullivan, take you, Isaac Dalton, to be my lawfully wedded husband, she said, her eyes locked on his. I promise to stand by your side through good times and bad, to work alongside you in building our life together, to love you with my whole heart for as long as we both shall live. I, Isaac Dalton, take you, Caitlin Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife, Isaac responded, his voice rough with emotion. I promise to honor you as my equal partner, to protect you without trying to own you, to love you with everything I have until my last breath. Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, and Isaac kissed his bride to the cheers and applause of the assembled hands. Buck was grinning like a fool. Pete was wiping tears from his eyes, and even taciturn Jim Corrigan was smiling broadly. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt. They ate the special dinner the cook had prepared, drank whiskey that Buck had been saving for a special occasion, and listened as various hands told embarrassing stories about Isaac's bachelor years. Caitlin laughed until she cried, and Isaac felt happiness bubble up in his chest like champagne. As the evening wound down and the hands dispersed to their bunks, Buck pulled Isaac aside. Blake was in town today, he said quietly. I heard from Pete, who'd gone in for supplies. Blake's been asking questions, trying to find out where Sullivan went. The general store owner told him he'd heard Sullivan had headed east toward Utah, not north toward Idaho. Blake's getting frustrated, but he's not giving up. He will eventually, Isaac said with more confidence than he felt. We'll make sure word spreads that the boss got married to a woman from back east who came out to join him. Nobody needs to know that woman used to work here as a hand. Give it a few months and Blake will move on to other concerns. Hope you're right, Buck said, but in the meantime, be careful. Desperate men do stupid things. Isaac took his new wife back to the main house that night, to the bedroom he'd shared with Margaret years ago but which he'd completely remade with new furniture and fresh paint. He'd wanted to erase the ghosts, to make this space belong to him and Caitlin alone, without the weight of the past pressing down on them. Caitlin stood in the center of the room, looking around with wide eyes. This is beautiful. You did all this for me. For us, Isaac corrected, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. This is our room now in our house on our ranch. Everything I have is yours, Caitlin. You're not just my wife, you're my partner in every sense of the word. They made love in the big bed with a tenderness and joy that transcended mere physical pleasure, celebrating the legal and spiritual bond they just formed. And afterward, as Caitlin fell asleep in his arms, Isaac stared at the ceiling and sent up a prayer of thanks to whatever benevolent force had brought this extraordinary woman into his life. The next morning brought a crisis that shattered their temporary peace. Isaac was in the barn checking on a horse with a stone bruise when Pete came running, his face pale with panic. Boss, Vernon Blake is back, and he's brought the sheriff with him. They're demanding to search the whole ranch, and they've got some kind of legal paper that says they can. Isaac's blood ran cold, but he forced himself to stay calm. Where's Caitlin? In the house, helping with breakfast. What do? We handle this legally and properly, Isaac said, straightening his shoulders. Blake wants to cause trouble. We'll show him he picked the wrong ranch to threaten. He walked out to the yard to find Blake sitting on his horse with Unionville's sheriff, a competent man named William Hart, who Isaac had known for years. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, which gave Isaac hope that he wasn't fully on Blake's side. "Morning, Sheriff Hart," Isaac said calmly. "What brings you out here so early?" "Sorry to bother you, Isaac," Hart said, dismounting. "Mr. Blake here filed a formal complaint yesterday. He's claiming you're harboring a woman named Casey Sullivan who ran away from a legal marriage contract in Arizona. He's got papers that seem to support his claim, so I have to investigate." "Happy to cooperate," Isaac said, "but I need to inform you that there is a woman named Caitlin on this property. However, she's not Blake's intended bride. She's my wife. We were married yesterday evening by Reverend Thomas, with my entire crew as witnesses." Blake's face turned purple with rage. "That's a lie. Casey Sullivan is mine. Her father promised her to me." "Her father's been dead for 2 years," Isaac shot back. "And Miss Sullivan, now Mrs. Dalton, made it clear she had no intention of honoring an arrangement she never agreed to in the first place. She's of legal age and free to marry whom she chooses. We chose each other. You're hiding her." Blake shouted, dismounting and taking a threatening step toward Isaac. "You knew I was looking for her, and you married her just to keep me from claiming what's mine." "She's not property to be claimed," Isaac said, his voice hard. "She's a human being with the right to make her own choices. And yes, I married her to protect her from you. I've seen enough of your behavior to understand exactly what kind of man you are, and I'll be damned before I let you drag her back to Arizona." Sheriff Hart held up his hands. "Let's all calm down. Blake, you're claiming this woman was legally promised to you. Isaac, you're claiming she's your wife. The only way to settle this is to talk to the woman herself." "Where is she?" "In the house," Isaac said. "I'll get her, but I want your word that Blake won't be allowed to intimidate or threaten her." "You have my word," Hart said firmly. "Blake, you stay here with me. Any attempt to approach the woman and I'll arrest you for harassment." Isaac walked to the house, his heart pounding. He found Caitlin in the kitchen, already aware that something was wrong. She'd put on a dress, another one that Buck had mysteriously provided, and her hair was braided and pinned up in a respectable style. "Blake is here with the sheriff," Isaac said without preamble. "They want to talk to you." "But Caitlin, you don't have to be afraid. You're my wife now. The law is on our side." She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "Then let's go face him. I'm tired of running." They walked out together, Isaac's hand firm on the small of Caitlin's back in a gesture of support and solidarity. Blake's eyes went wide when he saw her and then narrowed with possessive fury. "Caitlin," he called out, "thank God I found you. I've been searching for 2 years. Come here, we need to talk about going home." "I am home," Caitlin said clearly. "Mr. Blake, I told you before I left Arizona that I had no intention of marrying you. My father may have mentioned the possibility, but it was never a formal agreement and I never consented. I'm sorry you've wasted your time, but I'm married now. My husband and I would appreciate it if you would respect that and leave us in peace." "You can't be legally married without my permission," Blake protested. "You were promised to me." Sheriff Hart pulled out a small notebook. "Madam, I need to ask you some questions. Were you ever formally engaged to Mr. Blake? Did you sign any contracts or make any legal promises?" "No," Caitlin said firmly. "My father mentioned once that he thought Vernon would be a good match, but I made it clear I wasn't interested. After my father died, Mr. Blake proposed and I declined. When he wouldn't accept my refusal and started making threats, I left." "What kind of threats?" Hart asked, his expression darkening. Caitlin hesitated, then said quietly, "He said if I didn't marry him willingly, He'd make sure I had no other choice. He implied he would ruin my reputation or force the issue through other means. I was afraid of what he might do, so I ran. "Those are serious allegations," Hart said, turning to Blake. "You want to respond to that?" "She's lying," Blake spat. "She's just saying that to justify abandoning her responsibilities. Her father wanted her to marry me. She owes it to his memory to honor his wishes." "Actually, she doesn't," Hart said. "A woman of legal age has the right to refuse a marriage proposal, regardless of her father's wishes. And from what I'm hearing, there was never a formal engagement anyway, just informal discussions. Mr. Blake, I'm sorry, but you don't have a legal claim here. Mrs. Dalton is married to someone else now. That ends the matter." "No," Blake's voice rose to a shout. "She's mine. I've spent 2 years looking for her, spent a fortune tracking her down. I'm not leaving without her." He lunged toward Caitlin, and everything happened very fast. Isaac stepped in front of his wife. Buck appeared from the barn with a rifle, and Sheriff Hart grabbed Blake's arm and yanked him back. "That's enough," Hart said sternly. "Mr. Blake, you need to leave this property now. If you continue to harass the Daltons, I will arrest you for disturbing the peace and threatening behavior. Is that clear?" Blake's face was twisted with rage and something uglier, a possessive obsession that made Isaac's skin crawl. But faced with the sheriff's authority and the several armed ranch hands who'd appeared in response to the commotion, he had no choice but to back down. "This isn't over," Blake said, his voice shaking. "I'll find a way to make you pay for this. Both of you. Threatening people in front of a law officer probably isn't your smartest move," Hart observed dryly. "Mount up and ride out, Blake. If I see you on Dalton property again without an invitation, you'll be spending time in my jail. Understood?" Blake left, but the look he shot at Isaac and Caitlin promised that this was far from finished. They watched him ride away, and only when he was out of sight did Caitlin sag against Isaac, all the strength going out of her legs. "It's over," Isaac murmured, holding her close. "He can't touch you now. You're safe." But even as he said it, he felt the prickle of unease at the back of his neck. Men like Blake didn't give up easily, especially when they felt they'd been cheated out of something they believed was rightfully theirs. They would have to stay vigilant. Sheriff Hart declined an offer of coffee and headed back to town, but not before pulling Isaac aside. "Watch your back," he said quietly. "Blake has the look of a man who might do something stupid. If you see him around here again, send word immediately, and tell your hands to stay alert." The weeks that followed were tense, with everyone on the ranch watching for signs of Blake's return. But as November turned to December and winter settled over the high desert, there were no more incidents. Word filtered back through the usual channels that Blake had left Nevada, heading back toward Arizona. Slowly, the tension eased and life returned to something approaching normal. Caitlin gave up her disguise and began living openly as Isaac's wife. And to Isaac's surprise and relief, the community accepted her with minimal gossip. A few of the neighboring ranchers' wives came to call, curious about the new Mrs. Dalton, and Caitlin charmed them with her straightforward manner and obvious competence. She didn't try to pretend she was a traditional ranch wife content to stay in the house. Instead, she was honest about her skills and her role in running the ranch, and most of the women seemed to respect her for it. Christmas came, and Isaac and Caitlin celebrated quietly with the crew, exchanging small gifts and sharing a feast that rivaled anything Isaac remembered from his childhood. Caitlin gave him a pair of hand-tooled leather gloves she'd made herself, having learned the skill from her father. Isaac gave her a silver locket that had belonged to his mother, and when he fastened it around her neck, she cried and kissed him in front of everyone. The new year of 1883 arrived with cold and snow, and the ranch settled into the slower rhythm of winter work. There was still plenty to do, maintaining equipment, caring for the animals, cutting ice from the river for the ice house, but it was less frantic than the spring and summer pace. Isaac and Caitlin spent long evenings by the fire, reading or talking or simply sitting in comfortable silence, and Isaac marveled daily at his good fortune. In February, Caitlin announced she was pregnant. The news filled Isaac with a complex mixture of joy and terror. He wanted children with her, wanted to build a family, but he couldn't help remembering Margaret and Sarah, couldn't help fearing loss. Caitlin saw the fear in his eyes and took his hands in hers. "I know you're scared," she said gently. "I'm scared too. But we can't let fear stop us from living, Isaac. We have to trust that everything will be all right, and that even if it's not, we'll face it together." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the solid warmth of her body against his. "I love you," he said fiercely. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I couldn't survive losing you." "Then it's a good thing you're not going to lose me," Caitlin said with calm confidence. "I'm strong and I come from sturdy stock. My grandmother had 9 children and lived to be 87. I'll be fine, and so will our baby." As spring arrived and Caitlin's pregnancy progressed, she continued to work on the ranch despite Isaac's protests. She couldn't do the heavy labor anymore, but she could still ride and rope and make decisions about the operation. The hands treated her with a mixture of respect and protective concern, always making sure someone was nearby in case she needed help, but never suggesting she should retire to the house like a delicate flower. Buck, in particular, appointed himself as Caitlin's guardian, always positioning himself where he could keep an eye on her. Isaac teased him about it one evening, and the old foreman shrugged. "That woman saved this ranch," Buck said simply. "Before she came, we were short-handed and struggling. After she arrived, everything ran smoother, and she made you happy again, boss. That's worth protecting." In late September, as the heat of summer finally broke and the first hints of autumn touched the air, Caitlin went into labor. Isaac sent Pete racing for the doctor in Unionville, while he stayed with his wife, holding her hand and trying not to let his fear show. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Isaac prayed harder than he ever had in his life, bargaining with God for Caitlin's safety. But when the dawn light finally filtered through the bedroom windows, a baby's cry split the air, and the doctor was smiling. "You have a son," he announced. "A healthy boy, and your wife did beautifully." Isaac approached the bed on shaking legs and looked down at his wife and the tiny, red-faced infant in her arms. Caitlin was exhausted, her hair plastered to her head with sweat, but she'd never looked more beautiful to him. "A boy," she said, smiling up at him. "What should we name him?" Isaac thought about his father, who died when Isaac was young. "Matthew," he said. "Matthew John Dalton, if that suits you." "It's perfect," Caitlin said, then held out the baby to him. "Hold your son." Isaac took the tiny bundle with trembling hands, staring down at the miniature face with its closed eyes and tiny, perfect features. Love unlike anything he'd ever felt before flooded through him, protective and overwhelming and utterly transforming. This was his son, his and Caitlin's. A new generation, a new beginning, a future full of possibility. The ranch hands took turns peering in through the window to catch a glimpse of the new arrival, and Buck declared a holiday with extra whiskey rations for everyone. Over the next few days, neighbors arrived with gifts and congratulations, and Isaac realized that he and Caitlin had truly become part of the community, accepted and respected. One evening, when Matthew was 2 weeks old, Isaac sat in the rocking chair by the fire with his son sleeping on his chest while Caitlin recovered in bed. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first day when a quiet rider had approached through the heat shimmer to this moment of perfect domestic peace. "What are you thinking about?" Caitlin asked sleepily from the bed. "About how much has changed in a little over a year," Isaac said. "About how I thought I was done with happiness, and then you rode into my life and changed everything. About how grateful I am that Buck talked me into hiring you, even though I didn't know what I was really getting." Caitlin smiled. "Buck told me later that he knew there was something different about me from the start, but he figured anyone who could ride like I could deserved a chance. He's a good man." "The best," Isaac agreed. "I'm going to make him a partner in the ranch. He's earned it, and I want to make sure he's taken care of in his old age." "He'll appreciate that," Caitlin said. "Though I suspect he'll keep working until he drops, partner or not. Some men are just built that way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the gentle sounds of their son's breathing. Then Caitlin said quietly, "Do you ever worry that Blake will come back?" Isaac had been wondering when she would ask that question. The truth was he thought about it sometimes, usually in the dark hours before dawn when worry crept in. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But even if he does, it doesn't matter. You're my wife, Matthew is our son, and we have a whole community behind us. He has no power over you anymore." "I hope you're right," Caitlin said. "Because I finally feel safe, Isaac. For the first time since my father died, I feel like I have a home and a future. I don't want to lose that." "You won't," Isaac promised. "I'll make sure of it," and he meant it. Whatever it took, he would protect his family and the life they'd built together. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, with Isaac and Caitlin working side by side to build it into one of the most successful operations in the region. Buck became a full partner, and the crew expanded to include 12 regular hands plus seasonal workers during the busy times. Matthew grew into a sturdy, curious boy who could ride almost as well as his mother by the time he was 5 years old. In 1885, Caitlin gave birth to a daughter they named Emily Margaret, after Isaac's late wife and daughter. Caitlin had suggested the names, wanting to honor the family Isaac had lost, and he'd loved her even more for the gesture. Emily was quieter than her brother, with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and she had a particular affinity for animals that reminded Isaac poignantly of his first daughter Sarah. The threat of Vernon Blake faded into memory as the years passed with no sign of him. Word eventually reached them through various channels that he'd died in 1886, thrown from a horse while drunk and breaking his neck in the fall. Isaac felt no satisfaction in the news, just relief that the threat was finally and permanently removed. In 1887, two significant things happened. First, Isaac was elected to the state legislature, representing Humboldt County in Carson City. He'd never sought political office, but the community had urged him to run, wanting someone who understood the challenges facing ranchers and rural communities. He accepted reluctantly, worried about leaving the ranch, but Caitlin assured him she could manage things with Buck's help. And she did. While Isaac spent months in Carson City working on legislation to protect water rights and improve infrastructure, Caitlin ran the ranch with the same competence and skill she'd shown from the beginning. She earned the respect of neighboring ranchers, many of whom initially doubted a woman could handle the responsibility, but came to admire her practical intelligence and fair dealing. The second significant event was more personal. Pete Ramsey, who'd been with the ranch since before Caitlin's arrival, announced his engagement to a schoolteacher from Unionville. The wedding was held at the ranch, and as Isaac watched Pete dance with his new bride, he caught Caitlin's eye across the crowd and smiled. They'd started something here, he realized. Not just a successful business, but a community, a place where people could build lives and families and futures. In 1889, Matthew turned 6 and started school in Unionville, riding in each morning with whatever hands happened to be heading to town and riding back in the afternoon. Emily was 4 and already showing signs of being as headstrong as her mother. Isaac was 45, with silver threading through his dark hair, and Caitlin was 30, more beautiful to him than she'd been at 23. One evening in late summer, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Isaac and Caitlin sat on the porch watching the stars come out. It had become their habit over the years, this quiet time together at the end of each day, and Isaac treasured it more than he could express. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Giving up your freedom to become a wife and mother? You could have kept traveling, kept working as a hand, seen more of the country." Caitlin turned to look at him with surprise. "Regret it? Isaac, you gave me freedom. Before I met you, I was constantly hiding, constantly afraid of being discovered, constantly alone. You let me be myself, all of myself. I can work the ranch and be a mother and be your wife, and I don't have to choose between them or pretend to be something I'm not. How could I possibly regret that?" "I just want to make sure you're happy," Isaac said, "that you don't feel trapped or limited." "I'm happier than I ever imagined possible," Caitlin said, taking his hand and lacing their fingers together. "I have work that challenges me, children I adore, a husband I love more with each passing year, and a community that respects me for who I am. That's not a trap, Isaac. That's a gift beyond measure." They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead. Then Caitlin said softly, "Thank you for taking a chance on a quiet rider who showed up one July morning. Thank you for seeing past the disguise to the person underneath. Thank you for loving me enough to fight for me. You saved my life in more ways than you probably realize." "You saved mine too," Isaac said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was just existing before you came, going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. You reminded me what it means to be alive, to hope, to love. Everything good in my life now traces back to that day you rode onto this ranch." He pulled her close and kissed her, a long, slow kiss full of tenderness and promise. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come to bed," Caitlin said, standing and pulling him to his feet. "Tomorrow will be another long day, and I want to spend what's left of tonight showing you how much I love you." They went inside, arms around each other, and Isaac felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. This was what he'd been fighting for during the war, he realized. Not abstract ideals of union or freedom, but this. The right to build a life with someone you loved, to raise children in safety, to work land you owned and make it productive. The right to choose your own path and be judged on your merits rather than your circumstances of birth. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The children grew, the ranch expanded, and Isaac and Caitlin grew older together, their love deepening into something rich and complex and absolutely unshakable. Matthew showed an aptitude for business and started handling more of the ranch's financial dealings. Emily developed into an accomplished horsewoman who could gentle even the most difficult animals. In 1892, Isaac decided not to run for re-election to the legislature, wanting to spend more time at home as he entered his late 40s. The ranch was thriving, producing some of the finest cattle in Nevada, and both he and Caitlin wanted to enjoy the fruits of their labor rather than constantly striving for more. Buck was 70 by then, still working but finally starting to slow down. Isaac and Caitlin built him a small house on the ranch property, close enough that he could still be involved but far enough that he had privacy. The old foreman protested that he didn't need special treatment, but Isaac insisted. "You've been with me from the beginning," Isaac said. "You helped me build this ranch. You brought me the best hand I ever hired, even though you knew she wasn't what she seemed, and you've been a friend and advisor for over 20 years. This isn't charity, Buck. It's family taking care of family." Buck's eyes had gotten suspiciously bright at that, and he'd cleared his throat roughly and muttered something about getting back to work. But Isaac saw him wipe his eyes as he walked away, and knew the gesture had meant something to the old cowboy. In 1895, Matthew turned 12 and announced he wanted to learn every aspect of running the ranch. Isaac and Caitlin began training him in earnest, teaching him about breeding programs and market timing, about managing hands and maintaining equipment, about reading weather and understanding the land. The boy soaked it up like a sponge, showing the same natural aptitude that his mother had for all things related to horses and cattle. Emily, at 10, was less interested in the business side but loved the animals with a fierce passion. She spent hours in the barn, talking to the horses and cattle, and she had a gift for diagnosing illnesses and injuries that amazed even the local veterinarian. Caitlin said she was like her father, intuitive and observant, able to sense things that others missed. In 1897, Isaac turned 53 and Caitlin turned 38. They threw a party to celebrate both birthdays, inviting the whole community, and Isaac looked around at the crowd of friends and neighbors and hands, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. So many lives had intersected with theirs. So many people had become part of their story. Pete Ramsey was there with his wife and 3 children. Jim Corrigan had married and bought his own small spread north of Unionville. Several of the other original hands had moved on to new opportunities, but they stayed in touch, sending letters and occasionally visiting. And new hands had come to replace them, drawn by the ranch's reputation as a good place to work, where employees were treated fairly and given opportunities to prove themselves. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Buck pulled Isaac aside one more time. The foreman was moving slowly now, his arthritis making every step painful, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "I want you to know something," Buck said quietly. "Working here, helping you build this place, watching you and Caitlin create something lasting and good, that's been the honor of my life. I never had children of my own, but I've felt like this ranch, this family, was mine to protect and nurture. Thank you for giving me that." Isaac embraced the old man carefully, aware of his fragility. "Thank you for everything, Buck, for believing in this ranch when it was just a dream, for recognizing what Caitlin was and keeping her secret, for being the best friend a man could ask for. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Buck died peacefully in his sleep 2 months later, and the whole county turned out for his funeral. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple stone that read Silas Buck Patterson, foreman, friend, family. Isaac stood with his arm around Caitlin at the graveside, Matthew and Emily beside them, and mourned the passing of an era. But life continued as it always does. Matthew grew into a tall, capable young man who managed the ranch with the same blend of pragmatism and compassion that his parents had modeled. At 21, he married a rancher's daughter from the next county, a spirited young woman named Alice, who reminded Isaac strongly of Caitlin in her combination of strength and grace. Emily, at 16, was being courted by the new veterinarian's son, a quiet young man who shared her love of animals. Isaac watched his daughter fall in love with amused recognition, seeing in her all the same hesitations and hopes he'd felt at the beginning of his relationship with Caitlin. In 1902, Isaac was 62 and Caitlin was 43, and they were grandparents to Matthew and Alice's twin daughters. The ranch employed 20 hands and ran over 5,000 head of cattle. It was one of the largest and most successful operations in Nevada, known throughout the region for its quality stock and fair dealing. One evening, as they sat in their accustomed spot on the porch, Caitlin said thoughtfully, "Do you remember what Buck used to say about me?" "That I was the best rider he'd ever seen." "I remember," Isaac said. "And it was true. Still is, though I notice you don't break quite as many wild horses these days." Caitlin laughed. "I'm 43, not 23. I leave the wild horses to the younger hands." But that comment changed my life, you know. It was the first time someone had acknowledged my skills without qualification or surprise. Buck didn't say I was good for a woman or good considering my circumstances. He just said I was good, period. That meant everything. "You are good," Isaac said. "You're extraordinary. You took a ranch that was struggling and helped turn it into something remarkable. You raised 2 amazing children. You've been the best partner I could have imagined in business and in life. I've been telling people for 20 years that you're the best rider I ever hired, and I mean it every time. And I married the best man I've ever known," Caitlin said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "A man who saw past pretense and prejudice to the person underneath. A man who was willing to fight for what was right, even when it was complicated and risky. A man who spent 20 years treating me as an equal partner, never once suggesting I should be anything other than exactly who I am." They sat together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. 2 people who'd found each other against all odds and built something lasting and good. A rancher who discovered that his quietest hand was a woman. A cowboy's observation that she was the best rider he'd ever seen. A love story that had overcome disguise and danger to create family and legacy. Inside the house, they could hear their granddaughters laughing, the sound bright and joyful. In the barns, the horses nickered as the evening feed was distributed. Across the ranch, hands were finishing their day's work, settling into the rhythms of rural life. And on a hill overlooking it all, Buck's grave stood silent witness to everything they'd built. No regrets. Isaac asked, echoing the question he'd posed years before. "Not a single one," Caitlin said firmly. "Just gratitude for every day we've had together and every day still to come." They went inside together, hand in hand, to join their family for dinner. Outside, the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, constant and eternal, watching over the Nevada high desert and the ranch that had become home to so many dreams. The decades that followed brought inevitable changes. Matthew took over more of the ranch's daily operations as Isaac gradually stepped back, enjoying a semi-retirement that allowed him to focus on the parts of ranching he loved most. Emily married her veterinarian and moved to a neighboring town, but visited often with her growing brood of children. The ranch continued to thrive under Matthew's management, and Isaac felt profound satisfaction knowing that what he and Caitlin had built would continue after they were gone. In 1910, Isaac turned 70 and Caitlin turned 51. They were both showing the effects of decades of hard physical labor, with Isaac's back troubling him and Caitlin's joints stiffening on cold mornings. But they were healthy and active, still riding out to check on the herds, still involved in major ranch decisions, still deeply in love after nearly 30 years of marriage. One summer evening, as they sat together on the porch in the rocking chairs that had replaced the hard bench of earlier years, Caitlin said quietly, "I've been thinking about writing down our story. Not for publication, just for the family. So that Matthew's children and Emily's children and their children after them will know how this all began. How a woman disguised as a man rode onto this ranch looking for work and found a home instead. "I think that's a fine idea," Isaac said, "though you might want to leave out some of the more scandalous parts." Caitlin laughed. "Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe future generations need to know that love doesn't always follow the rules, and that sometimes the best things in life come from taking risks and defying expectations." "You certainly defied expectations," Isaac said with a smile. "Nobody expected that quiet hand who barely spoke to be the woman who would transform this ranch and my life. And nobody expected the stern rancher to be a man with such a generous heart," Caitlin countered. "You gave me a chance when most men would have sent me away. You saw my value before you even knew I was a woman, and you continued to see it after. That's rare, Isaac. That's special." They rocked in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the mountains and the evening air cooled. Caitlin did write down their story, sitting at the kitchen table during quiet afternoons, filling page after page with her neat handwriting. She wrote about riding toward the ranch with desperation and hope warring in her chest. About the moment Isaac discovered her secret and she'd been certain her world was about to end. About falling in love gradually and then all at once. About the terror of Blake's pursuit and the joy of their wedding. About building a life and family together. Isaac read the pages as she finished them, often moved to tears by her honest recounting of their journey. She'd captured not just the facts but the emotions, the fear and courage and love that had shaped their story. When she finished, she bound the pages into a leather journal and presented it to Matthew and Emily, asking them to preserve it for future generations. "This is your inheritance," she told them. "Not just the ranch and the land and the money, but this story. The story of how love and courage and stubbornness can create something lasting and good. Remember it and teach it to your children." The years continued their relentless march. Isaac and Caitlin celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1913, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends. It was a joyous occasion, filled with laughter and reminiscence, and Isaac felt the circle of his life closing in the most satisfying way possible. He died in his sleep in the spring of 1915, at the age of 74, with Caitlin beside him holding his hand. It was peaceful and gentle, exactly as he would have wished. The funeral drew people from all over Nevada, ranchers and politicians and former ranch hands and townspeople, all coming to pay their respects to a man who'd lived with integrity and built something meaningful. Caitlin grieved deeply, but without bitterness. She'd had 32 years with Isaac, far more than she'd ever dreamed possible on that July day when she'd ridden toward his ranch dressed as a man and hoping for work. She'd been loved and valued and respected. She'd raised children and helped build a legacy. She'd lived fully and without regret. She remained active in ranch operations for several more years, still riding out to check cattle when the weather was good, still consulted on major decisions. Matthew treated her opinions with the respect they deserved, and Alice, his wife, had become like a daughter to her. Emily visited often, bringing her children to spend summers at the ranch, continuing the tradition of raising another generation with an understanding of the land and the work. Caitlin lived until 1928, dying at the age of 69, surrounded by family in the house she'd shared with Isaac. Her last words, whispered to Matthew as he held her hand, were, "Tell them the story. Always tell them the story." And they did. Matthew told it to his children, who told it to theirs. Emily told it to her grandchildren, emphasizing different parts depending on the child and the moment. The leather-bound journal was carefully preserved, passed down through generations as a treasured family heirloom. The ranch continued to operate successfully well into the 20th century, always known as a place where hard work was valued, and people were judged on their abilities rather than their circumstances. And sometimes, on quiet summer evenings when the heat shimmered across the high desert and the mountains turned purple in the distance, ranch hands would swear they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the old house, rocking gently and holding hands, watching over the land they'd loved and the legacy they'd built together. The story of Isaac and Caitlin Dalton became legend in Humboldt County, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy, but always with admiration. The rancher who discovered his quietest hand was a woman. The cowboy's observation that she was the best rider he'd ever seen. The love that had overcome prejudice and danger to create something lasting and true. It was a story about courage and disguise, about seeing past appearances to the person underneath, about building a partnership based on respect and equality. It was a story about the American West in all its harsh beauty and unexpected kindness, about people who worked hard and loved deeply and left the world better than they found it. And though the ranch eventually passed out of family hands in the 1950s, though the buildings were modernized and the operation mechanized, though nothing remained of the 19th century structures where Isaac and Caitlin had lived and worked and loved, the story endured. Because some stories are too important to forget, too meaningful to let fade. They become part of the land itself, woven into the fabric of a place, carried forward through generations not as ancient history but as living memory. In a small museum in Unionville, Nevada, visitors can still see Caitlin's journal, carefully preserved behind glass. They can read her account of riding toward the ranch in July 1882, disguised as a man and desperate for work. They can see the wedding certificate signed by Reverend Thomas and witnessed by Buck Patterson and the ranch crew. They can look at photographs from later years showing Isaac and Caitlin together, their faces marked by sun and wind and years, but their eyes still bright with love. And sometimes, people who visit the museum leave inspired, carrying with them the message that Caitlin wrote on the final page of her journal. In a world that often demands we be less than we are, find the courage to be yourself completely. Find the people who see your true value. Build something lasting with them. And never, ever let fear stop you from riding toward the horizon, even when you don't know what waits on the other side. It was advice born of experience, tested by fire, proven through a lifetime of choosing courage over comfort, authenticity over disguise, love over loneliness. It was the legacy of a woman who dared to claim her own destiny, and a man who'd had the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the best things in life come in unexpected packages. And it was the heart of a story that began with a quiet rider approaching through the summer heat, and ended with a love that transcended time, circumstance, and the limitations that others tried to impose. A love that built a family, a ranch, and a legacy that endured long after the principles had passed into memory. The sun set over the Nevada high desert, as it had for millennia before and would for millennia after. The mountains stood eternal, watching over the valley where cattle grazed and new generations built their own dreams. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, if you listened carefully enough, you might hear the echo of hoofbeats, the soft murmur of voices, the sound of two people who'd found each other against all odds and refused to let anything separate them. Their story was over, but it was also eternal, living on in every person who chose courage, in every love that defied convention, in every quiet rider who approached an uncertain future with nothing but skill and determination and hope. It was the story of the American West, of human possibility, of the truth that sometimes the best rider you ever hired turns out to be the love of your life. And that was exactly as it should be.